Hello again, welcome to my January reading wrap up. I'm very proud this month because this has probably been like the best reading month that I've had in quite a while. I read 8 things this month, which I read a lot, but I'm not pushing those like 100+ numbers that you see people achieving. I'm always slightly bitter about my Goodreads, storygraph, whatever reading goal because I read all day. But obviously, you know, like Amy Kaufman's many essays on Lamort Arthur aren't necessarily included towards your Goodreads reading tab, which is unfortunate, but such is life. So the goal that I set this year was 54 books, which may seem like a random number, because it is. But basically, if I hit my goal from the previous year, then I just up it 1 from that year. So last year I did manage to read 53 books, so I put it up to 54 this month. And I probably wouldn't have read 8 things total, at least in like the Goodreads tabulations, if I hadn't been taking a Virginia Woolf seminar, which included a lot of her essays, which thankfully are all published in kind of book form. So those count. My reading this month is definitely influenced by the seminars that I'm taking. I'm taking one on George Eliot and then one on Virginia Woolf. So in February, we're just kind of getting into more Virginia Woolf's fiction. So the first book we're reading is Mrs. Dalloway. And I have started that, but I haven't finished it yet or anything, so I'm not going to talk too much about that one. I am going to include The Mill on the Floss, even though I'm not technically done this either, but I'm like basically done, so it counts. This is my second George Eliot book. I read Adam Bede during my undergrad for a class on the British novel from the Victorian period, and I kind of accidentally, semi-accidentally, wound up taking a lot of Victorian literature classes during my undergrad, and I discovered that while I enjoy taking classes and discussing Victorian literature, I sort of hate Victorian literature itself, because basically, I think it's because of Thomas Hardy. Me and Thomas Hardy have major beef. But basically, Victorian literature is nothing good ever happens to anybody, and especially women, and the woman usually like dies, goes insane, is imprisoned, executed, murdered, whatever, and then a boring man learns something about it. And that is low-key also the plot of Adam Bede, but I will say I think that my experience of Adam Bede was very much colored by how much I hate Tess of the D'Urbervilles, and I had to like just read it for the second time in that class. And Adam Bede, it's not like the same plot, but it is sort of like semi-similar. It hits a lot of the same notes. So it got a lot of my like carried over hatred from Tess of the D'Urbervilles. But after reading Mill on the Floss, I'm curious to maybe go back and read Adam Bede. I probably won't be doing that anytime soon because it's not on the syllabus for this class. But yeah, because I've been enjoying this one so much and it's making me go like, maybe I misjudged Adam Bede. Although I will say it's been a while since I've read that book. But I do still believe that Adam Bede himself is quite possibly the most boring character that's ever been written, ever. But Mill on the Floss is about Maggie and Tom Tolliver, who are 2 young children living sort of in the countryside. The first, probably like solid half of the book traces their childhood. The book is split into like a bunch of mini books. And yeah, the first part is tracing their childhood because you basically want to see like where they come from. It's really kind of like a psychological study so that you can understand why they're making the decisions that they're making into adulthood. Essentially, their father has gotten himself into a lot of debt. They've gotten themselves into like a bad financial corner. He's sending Tom away to school because he wants Tom to basically be able to compete with the lawyers and to be able to do all of this business and like save their mill and save their family essentially. But he's sending Tom away to get like the education of a gentleman. So Tom is like learning the classics. He's learning all of this more like theoretical math. He's learning how to draw pictures instead of how to sketch maps. So he's not actually getting the kind of education that will help him in this like practical situation, but his father also doesn't like have the education or the knowledge to really know how to manage Tom's own schooling. And while Tom is away at school, he meets Philip Wakeham, who is a boy who has a disfigurement, but he's like the son of a very wealthy lawyer in town, one of the lawyers that their father kind of sees as being like the one that's ruining them. And so they have this rivalry. The father is like, you need to hate him forever. But Maggie is like a very precocious young girl. Everyone's always like, it's too bad Tom didn't get her cleverness because it's wasted on this girl, essentially. But her father is very doting on her. He really wants, you know, Tom to protect her and look after her into adulthood. And Maggie just like is so desperate for everyone's love and approval, and she really wants people to like recognize and appreciate her cleverness, but people are very sort of like dismissive or belittling of it because she's a girl, except for Philip. So they sort of like develop this friendship, but obviously once they're into adulthood, that is a problem because they've like the families have decided to be sworn enemies. And then later, Maggie also is very close with her cousin Lucy. So into adulthood, she meets Lucy and her fiance Stephen, and that causes some other problems. And then I won't spoil the ending, but this is Victorian literature, so it's not happy. I am enjoying this a lot more than I thought I would. It is kind of like slow and meandering, but it's really, really interesting, and it does make me more keen to read more of George Eliot's works. I really loved the childhood sections. Actually, I kind of thought that I'd be really eager to get through the childhood stuff to then get more into their adulthood. But I think it's just because kind of that like middle portion of their adulthood is like a real transition phase for them, because it's when the family goes destitute, like when everything finally blows up. So it's them like stepping into their new roles, like with Tom kind of trying to take this over and to save their family, and Maggie really struggling with everything and struggling to like find her place within that. Yeah, they're kind of like two co-protagonists, although obviously, you know, with a contemporary audience, Maggie probably is the most compelling. But I actually find Tom really interesting as well, because on the one hand, he's such a jerk and he does treat Maggie so poorly in moments, but then he's also right a lot of the time, and it's this kind of back and forth. And yeah, seeing their relationship develop from childhood into adulthood and what they carry over and what they're able to grow from or move past is really fascinating. And yeah, I've been quite enjoying this, so I'm looking forward to our next book. We're reading Felix Holt the Radical next. I'm just kind of going in reverse chronological order. So the last thing that I read for Virginia Woolf was On Being Ill, and then a bunch of essays about the Dreadnought hoax, because basically her and I think it was her brother and then like a friend basically put on blackface and boarded this naval ship to like trick the officers into thinking that they were these dignitaries, basically. It's a whole thing. It's like one of the most famous hoaxes or practical jokes in history. So we're actually going to be talking about that in class today, and I'm really interested to hear everyone's thoughts. I had no idea about this, about Virginia Woolf, so that was interesting. But we also read On Being Ill, which is very different. It's an essay that she wrote about writing from illness. So she wrote it from her sickbed, and one of the kind of like main things that she discusses is that there isn't enough writing, or there isn't enough language to capture writing on illness. Like there's a plethora of writing on sort of semi-related topics and like love sickness and heartache and all this other stuff, but like physical illness doesn't have the same doesn't take up the same literary space and doesn't have the same wealth of language to describe it, which I hadn't really thought of. But in retrospect, then you're thinking about all of the writers who were like really famous for being ill, basically, like someone like Keats. And like when people do write about illness, it's really steeped in heavy metaphor. So yeah, I found that quite interesting. We're supposed to write like 3 questions for the readings for the week. So I put up a question that was kind of touched on the idea of like, what about in kind of the contemporary space where like memoir and poetry and even like kind of sentimental films about illness or about like witnessing illness are really popular? Is that doing the thing that she's sort of like promoting, or is it just feeding into this other kind of like more sort of almost like exploitative method of employing illness? So yeah, I don't know if we'll touch on that in the discussion, but I did find that essay quite interesting, and I'd heard of it before, but I'd never read it, and it wasn't what I was expecting, because she's not always talking very specifically about illness. Like later in the essay, she's talking about other things, and at one point she's talking about like reading Shakespeare and reading the greats, and also reading them as someone who's ill, and that almost like kind of giving you more leave to enjoy it because you're not almost like competing with it or something. I don't know. It's a cool read. It's probably harder to follow along with than something like A Room of One's Own, but it is also shorter. And yeah, I'm curious what people have to say on that, because our discussion of A Room of One's Own was really interesting. And I feel like people have a lot of conflicting feelings about Woolf, and I feel that that will really become apparent in today's class, because this is, I would say, it's definitely like getting into her more controversial ideologies, because I actually didn't find A Room of One's Own when I was reading it to be that spicy. She's basically like, women should be able to write and writers need money. Obviously then you start discussing like kind of her opinions on class and everything and what is she leaving out. But overall, this idea of like, yeah, writers need an income and a certain amount of security in order to do work, because how much are we missing? Because people other than, you know, wealthy white men didn't have that. But obviously then getting into like the Dreadnought hoax, talking about her sort of relationship to illness, is going to be getting more, I think, into the directly gritty details. So I'm looking forward to it. And then prior to that, my next couple books are more things from my Woolf class. So next up I have Rooms, Women, Writing, and Woolf by Sina Queyras. I'm not totally sure on the pronunciation of their last name. I don't totally know how to describe the form. It's sort of memoir, it's sort of prose, like narrative nonfiction. It gets poetic at certain moments, but it's essentially like writing about their sort of experience with Woolf over time, their experience in academia, and it's also kind of trying to, it's almost doing like the form of A Room of One's Own in like the contemporary moment. And I'm not gonna lie, this one I was a bit ambivalent about. Like, I didn't dislike it, but I didn't love it either. I almost wanted it to speak a lot more directly about Woolf, because I feel like she got name dropped a lot. The author referenced different books that they were reading at different moments quite a few times, but they never actually really spoke particularly specifically about Woolf or about a lot of the ideas in A Room of One's Own. Like, they're talking about their own rooms and everything, but it's very much rooted in themselves and in like this kind of individual experience. And I don't think that it goes to the macro in the way that A Room of One's Own does, which on the one hand is perhaps more contemporary perspective, not wanting to like be super prescriptive and like this is something universally that we need. But also, if you're trying to discuss the themes of A Room of One's Own and being like, okay, what does this look like in the contemporary moment? I think you just kind of have to. I don't know, sometimes it felt like it was so specific that it almost lacked specificity, if that makes any sense at all. I don't know, there were interesting bits. The thing that I found probably most successful at that project of like, let's bring Woolf into the contemporary moment, was when she was describing her experience with Professor Norton, they're called in the book, because that was like this was basically a very misogynistic professor that they encountered during their undergrad, I believe, or maybe during their master's. And this guy essentially having like these fanboys in class, but he can't look any of the female or gender non-conforming students in the eye. Really like vitriolic towards Queyras, and like at one point I think like throws a chair and is looming over them because they like dared to question why they got the mark that they did on an assignment, and him not being to like articulate actually why, other than that he just didn't like it. And so I found that section to be quite interesting because it's also, I think, emphasizing even more than Woolf does in A Room of One's Own, like the cyclical nature of that kind of mentality within academia. And then before that, I did read A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf, which this was my first time reading it in its entirety. I wasn't sure how much of this I'd read before because I had to read it a few times during my undergrad and everything, but I think it was just the last like chapter or two that I hadn't read before. This is really fascinating. I would definitely recommend reading it if you're interested in Woolf at all, or about kind of writing about writing. And I think that this is one of the things that gets her like fairly or unfairly kind of branded as like poster child for white feminism. And we did read a few essays with a lot of really interesting critiques of Woolf, definitely kind of rooted in what she discusses in A Room of One's Own. And I don't know how much of it I totally agree with. Again, this is also coming from like a white woman, so because I think that a lot of the critiques are like, oh, she's ignoring class, but I think she's actually very aware of class, and she speaks very openly about her own income. Like she says, I kind of just randomly have this inheritance that I get monthly from this wealthy aunt. I get it basically because we had the same name, and she died. This is exactly how much it is a month, and this is what allows me to live in comfort and to devote significant time to my own writing practice. And that's what I need, because she'd already at this time, I believe, kind of had quite a like literary representation. Like she was regarded as a genius in her own time. And I think that that is quite powerful to be like, this isn't just my own exceptionalism that's allowing me to do this. There are very like clear practical realities that allow people to do this kind of work. And she does discuss some authors who maybe didn't have exactly that. Like she talks about Jane Austen, who wrote from her drawing room and was kind of constantly interrupted, and how that may or may not have like worked for her, benefited her own writing, but that isn't necessarily, you know, the rule or the blueprint for women's writing. I did also see one critique of the sort of Judith Shakespeare section, which is possibly one of the most famous bits from A Room of One's Own, because it's essentially where Woolf sort of traces the lives of like, what would the life of someone who was as talented as Shakespeare, was from the same social class, have looked like, but she was a woman, so she wouldn't have been allowed or supported in her creative endeavors. And she essentially ends with, she probably would have killed herself. And one of the essays we read was basically like, how come it has to be Judith Shakespeare? How come it has to be her sister? How come it can't, she couldn't have imagined like the life of a maid? It's almost like that's the entire point, that it's someone who had the exact same material circumstances as Shakespeare. The only difference is she's a woman. That is very intrinsic to the metaphor. So some of the critiques I found more fair. Some of them I think were a real stretch. And yes, is this completely applicable to today's contemporary reality? No. Is she sort of talking about like a very specific kind of woman? Yes, but also no, because she is also, people argue that this is essentially an argument for universal basic income, because she says you need about 500 pounds a year, which I think someone said that they looked it up and that would translate to about 50,000 a year in today's time. So it's like, it's significant, but she's not being like, you need to be rich in order to do this work. She's saying that you need to not be struggling. Which, I don't know, I think is fair. I do think that, and like obviously she also had some very problematic worldviews, but I also think to say like, oh, this is just feminism 101, like yeah, if it was written now, maybe, but at this point, no one was talking about, like no one had said this before, so you need someone to say the basic thing before you can build on it. I don't know. So I think being like Woolf is completely, you know, universally applicable in today's world. Like, no, probably not. But also just to completely write off everything that's in here, I don't know that that's entirely fair either. I also found the bits where she's talking about her experience at Oxford and Cambridge really interesting to read this time around, because this was my first time reading it since having been at Oxford myself. And so even just the descriptions of the place I really enjoyed, because she kind of describes like taking a walk through everything. And then also, yeah, like what places she's allowed to enter and what places she's not, because like, again, her class-wise, other than being a woman, she should have access to all of those places. Like, I think her brothers all went to Eton. But yeah, I also kind of kept thinking about like at the time when she delivered these speeches, she delivered this to a group at Cambridge, I believe. Yeah, she delivered it to, it's over the course of, I think, like 2 lectures at Cambridge maybe. And then it's also like edited and expanded for the edition that they published. So she's speaking to the kind of 2 like women's colleges at Cambridge. Apparently people interviewed the people who were there and they were like, we were all bored out of our minds. But I mean, even at the time that she delivered these speeches, I believe women at Oxford had just for like a few years been able to actually graduate with certificates. Women at Cambridge still couldn't. So women at Cambridge still were not being awarded degrees, still don't have access to all of the libraries. So I think that like those kind of material circumstances and like what she's specifically discussing are really important to keep in mind when you're reading this. Like she's talking about academia, she is talking about like kind of a specific literary set. So in that way, yeah, it is like a very narrow kind of portrait, but I also think that it's supposed to be. And then when she is speaking more universally, I think her candidness is quite something. So yeah, I think that there are definitely a lot of fair critiques of Woolf and of this text specifically, but some of them also I think are maybe take it, like the thing about Judith Shade, that one really threw me off because I was like, that's the entire point of this whole thing. So some of them I think perhaps extended a bit too far in the effort to make their own point, but I do think some of those points are still, of course, like very valid and worth critiquing. Okay, and then back to George Eliot, I read Janet's Repentance, which is a novella within Scenes of Clerical Life. This one I enjoyed. I feel like, again, this is like a very mini kind of like snapshot of Eliot and of Victorian writing more generally. Essentially, it's about, again, this woman and these people in like a very small town. There's kind of this like religious break because it's like, do you follow this one pastor or this other pastor? And it's about this woman who has an alcoholic and abusive husband. She herself becomes an alcoholic to kind of like deal with this abuse. And it's her relationship to her husband who dies eventually. And then also she kind of goes against him to start listening to this other, I think pastor is the right word, reverend? I'm not sure. I forget. So it's like her relationship to religion. It wasn't my favorite. I found the beginning quite confusing because you're just like being introduced really rapidly to all of these people, and also the kind of like religious situation, which isn't something that I know a ton about for that time period. So I did just find it like a bit hard to get my bearings in this one. But once I did, it was enjoyable. And the latter half definitely goes a lot faster. I haven't read any of the novellas from Clerical Life other than this one, but this one I enjoyed. I don't like it as much as Mill on the Floss, but they're also like very different texts. And then back to Woolf, this was the first thing that I read for my Woolf class, which was How Should One Read a Book? Again, this was a lecture to a girls' school originally, and then was, I think, you know, like, I don't know if this one was adapted in the same way that A Room of One's Own was to be like a published text, or if it was like afterwards they published her lecture notes. I'd have to double check on that one. I can't remember off the top of my head. But this one was also really interesting. I went into it being like, this is gonna be really pretentious and again, like very prescriptive for how you need to like approach reading literature, but it really wasn't. It starts off very like, benefit of literature is freedom and like exploring these libraries, which actually women wouldn't have had a lot of access to is about freedom and the freedom of your own mind and your own thought. Like, don't just listen to what librarians and critics and these other, you know, staunchy people are telling you. Like, come up with your own opinions. Don't even necessarily listen to my opinions. But here are also my musings on literature. So yeah, that wasn't what I was expecting to get, so I was kind of pleasantly surprised by that. And then yeah, this is just kind of like discussing her own, you know, thoughts about reading different kinds of literature. And my last 3 novels are a real vibe change. I don't know if I can say the title of this one and still take myself seriously. I read Hot Wolf in the Country by Honey Phillips. Listen, sometimes you just need a small town werewolf romance to get you through January. I enjoy Honey Phillips novellas. They're basically all like small town romances, but they just happen to be with like various mythical creatures, and they're fun. It's fun. I don't know if it's like a series, but there's like another book. This is an interconnected standalone, so you get the drill. The first one I think is better. This one I found the FMC a bit annoying, to be honest. She's very like, I'm not like other girls, I'm so different, I'm so quirky. And I'm like, listen, all of these people are werewolves. Having pink hair is not going to make you the most interesting person in this novel. It was fun, but I would recommend the first book in that over this one. And then I actually reread Complicated by Kristen Ashley, which I think this was like my 3rd or 4th time rereading this. This isn't one of my favorite Kristen Ashleys, and I remember the first time I read it, I was like, oh yeah, I didn't mind this, but it's not my favorite. But for some reason, I've been compelled to reread it many, many times. So I guess do with that information what you will. So in this book, Hickson Drake is like the town sheriff of this small Nebraska town. Him and his wife of 20 years have just divorced. He has absolutely no idea why she initiated it. So they've been separated for like a year or so now. They've kind of like just finalized everything. He's still kind of like trying to get his life in order from that. When he meets Greta, who is a hairstylist, also a lounge singer, they kind of hook up, but he's like, my life is too complicated for all of this, but also they just can't stay away. So it's them kind of thinking about like, can we actually do this? Is this the right time? Whatever. And then someone gets murdered, and that never happens in this town. He was like a former city cop, so he's like, I can handle this. But essentially, yeah, is trying to find this murder because it seems super random. And there's really like no trace of the guy who did this. So they're trying to solve that while also trying to kind of start up this relationship, and also his ex-wife is being a problem. So there's a lot of fires to put out, basically. I think the reason why I don't generally like this book as much as some other Kristen Ashley ones is because one of the things that I really like is how everyone kind of fits in the town, and I think that the other side characters in her small town romances are so good. And in this one, I feel like it's not as much. If we have other like things like her Colorado Springs series, like the one with Sweet Dreams and everything, in those series, the guys are also like Tate's a bounty hunter, like they've got crazy jobs. These guys are way too like specifically skilled in things that don't make sense for the towns that they're in to be in the towns that they're in. But also she writes it in a way where like it still makes sense, and you're like, yeah, you can find this place and life satisfying. But I feel like this book never quite gets there. It tries to, because like prior to this murder, Hickson had been like, I feel guilty for being bored, but also I'm bored. Like all I do is tell people to like move their cows. Even though like Greta and also his kids like help him see and like feel a bit more content with where they are, it also does feel like, well, would you be? But I do really like Greta and I do really like Greta and Hicks. They have really good chemistry. They have good banter. There's a lot of like high point, like there's a lot of moments in the book that are really good. So I do enjoy this. It's a fun reread. And then the first book that I read this year is actually the book that Megan got me for my birthday. So It had been sitting on my shelf for quite a while and was also very seasonally inappropriate. It's This Summer Will Be Different by Carley Fortune, which I believe is a later book in, again, that like series of standalones. I'm not sure if the people in this book, if some of the other people in this book are like couples from a previous book or not. I didn't get the vibe that they were, but maybe they are. But essentially in this novel, Lucy lives in Toronto. She becomes best friends with, what is her name? Bridget. She becomes best friends with Bridget, who's from Prince Edward Island. When I believe they're like both working at the same company. It's kind of their first jobs out of college. Or she decides to go back with Bridget to Prince Edward Island for the summer. She shows up earlier than Bridget, so she's kind of on her own for a couple days. She winds up meeting this like too good looking for his own good local. They kind of hook up, and then they realize that it's Bridget's brother, who had previously dated one of Bridget's friends for quite a while, and they had a bad breakup. So Bridget was like, there are 3 rules. A couple of them are just like having fun. And then the third one is don't fall in love with my brother. So Lucy's like, uh-oh, we can't tell Bridget. And then over the course of like 5 years, Lucy kind of periodically goes back to visit Prince Edward Island. She's always like, I'm not gonna hook up with Felix. And then she does. And now in this present timeline, because we get kind of like flashbacks to each of the previous summers. In the present timeline, Bridget kind of calls Lucy to come to Prince Edward Island, really out of the blue, seems like an emergency, and Lucy freaks out because Bridget's supposed to be getting married in 2 weeks. So she heads to the island. Bridget's being very cagey about what's going on, and Felix is there. And the two kind of start a more sort of like serious relationship, I guess. I think I rated this like 3 or 3.5 stars. I enjoyed it. I didn't find it's not like super memorable to me. The best part of it is the way that she describes PEI, which I've never actually been, but I don't know, the way that she describes it seems accurate to me. And I think the way, she describes like the setting and the small town, I think is where this book really shines. Something that I think would have helped this book was that it just felt like, okay, why are they in love? And extra, why is Felix like in love with her? Because honestly, like I get why she's into Felix, but it is this idea that like, she's kind of seeing him in isolation, and she's like, I don't like it's hard for me to imagine that he like, continues living here after I leave. And I feel like they never kind of resolve that. Like, they're speaking more, but I don't know. It was just like, the resolution to their relationship was like a bit unsatisfying, or I feel like didn't overcome a lot of their previous problems. One thing that I did really like was that each summer you could see Felix changing and him kind of like maturing and growing into himself. And I just feel that Lucy didn't really have that. Like, she seemed like the same person she was at the beginning. And towards the end of the book, there is this kind of moment where she's like, I need to figure out what I want. I need to be okay with like my life as it is, and with, Bridget's life changing. What does that mean for mine? So I did appreciate that like there was kind of that recognition, but I did just kind of like find the resolution a bit like, all of this is really on Lucy's terms, and Felix actually seems like a more interesting person. And I feel like this book needed to be dual point of view, or at least have a few chapters from his point of view, so that we could really see Lucy outside herself, because she's a bit neurotic throughout this book. And I think as much as like it does show who these other characters are quite effectively, I feel like we don't necessarily see a lot of like Lucy outside of her own perception of herself, if that makes sense. And also there are all these things that go into like making her why is she kind of crazy? And a lot of it is like her family relationships, her like grief at losing her one aunt, but those are things that were told a lot and not shown. And so I think either having more flashbacks to kind of see that, or see more of her relationship with her family in the present timeline, would have helped with that. But I did enjoy this. I thought that generally the writing was quite good. I think there were just like some character things or some chemistry things even between the leads. Like, I needed to see more of them together than just Lucy kind of thinking about him, if that makes sense. But yeah, I wouldn't say it's like a new all-time favorite romance novel, but I definitely enjoyed it and I would absolutely read more of her books in the future. So yeah, that was all that I read in January. I'm hoping that I can maintain this pace in the coming months, but we shall see. I believe I'm like 4 books ahead of schedule by Goodreads and Storygraph's calculations, so we shall see. But everything that I'm reading in my seminar classes is going to be a bit longer moving forward, so I'm sure my numbers will take a bit of a nosedive, but I'm also hoping that I can continue to read books on my own time and for fun, so, you know, fingers crossed that that happens, because that's got nothing to do with me. But yeah, thanks for watching. If you read anything interesting or read any of these books, let me know, and yeah, catch you in the next one.